in particular, and poverty in the first panel. Gender, I think, is a major component here, especially in places where you have women who are going to be bearing the brunt of effects like drought if they're dealing with water, for example. That's just one element of it. So that has to be part of the intersectional dimension of these inequalities. We also have the corresponding economic power concentration in elites and corporations. So that's the other part of the power imbalance. The other piece that I would bring out here is that you also have an urban-rural divide. Maybe that's the partly what's going on with Puerto Rico and Houston, but part of this is that conversation is a piece of this puzzle as well. So there's the structural and chronic power imbalances and the racial inequities and gender and poverty. Second thing is, I think we now know that the scale of this is going to be something that we haven't seen before. And all three of these examples bring that out. We're talking about the entire East Coast. We're talking about the entire society of Somalia. We're talking about the way entire cities or islands are affected. This scale is unprecedented. The numbers, 250 million people being displaced. The scale is both at the level we are not used to, and it's going to be chronic and recurring. And the third piece, I think, is that we have gaps in law and policy. Here, for me, a couple of observations. One is, for me, we have these at both the local level and domestic level and international. We also have them in particular around, if you think about hard law and soft law. So the Nansen Initiative is really a soft law instrument. It isn't a binding instrument like a treaty. There's been a lot of activity in that space, as Matthew Scott spoke about on the second panel. The follow-up to the Nansen Initiative is the platform on disaster displacement. They're both intergovernmental efforts. The first one is from 2012 to 2015, and the platform on disaster displacement is ongoing from 2016 to 2019. Those are much more of a guiding principles kind of a framework where you get a toolkit and get action, but you don't get hard treaties compliance. So there's a particular gap around the hard law, but there's been some movement on the principle side and on the toolkit side that's a more soft law kind of approach. The last piece, before I get to where I think we might go or want to talk, is that for me, where we are is also that we've talked about the gap. To me, the gap, or non-governance, we could call it, non-governance is actually a decision. So we can say we can govern this space, but also the decision not to govern, that is a particular way of governing. And so that brings me to where I think when I was thinking about what is Beyond Borders about, to me, borders indicate some sort of a division. And all of the different things that we've been talking about are about divisions, whether they're political divisions or they're cultural divisions, whether they're racial or economic divisions, it's all about divisions. So to me, Beyond Borders is about thinking about a different way of thinking about things and starting with something that doesn't start with division, but starts with a different way of thinking. To me, for example, it is not a, is there law or not law? It's about law and policy. That's a false division. Hard law and soft law are false divisions. It's about these things actually reinforce each other, and we need to actually think about more comprehensive ways of thinking. Not an either or, should we have hard law or soft law? Comprehensive would have both. And maybe we're getting action in one space, but we should also have eventual action in the other space too. So that's what I would like to say in terms of solutions or thinking about Beyond Borders is the governance space, I think, is where the action is. So two final thoughts on this. One is that this governance space should be layered. So that came up in the second panel. And that goes all the way down to the household. Household, neighborhood, city, state, national level, regional level, international. But that layering also seems like it's divided. It doesn't necessarily have to be perceived that way. Another way of thinking about it is that really a holistic, and as opposed to borders, a holistic governance system is one that's more like a web. And so I would like I'm playing with this idea. I'd love reactions to this idea of we need to think about resilient governance. there's a lot of talk about resiliency and climate change, but not necessarily in the governance space. And to me, for example, why that matters is when we're talking about decades and we look at the moment right now of the Trump administration not believing in climate change and attacking climate change conventions, that takes the US government at the national level out. But the responses are at the local level and the state level. You get more action there, you get more action internationally. If we see it as a web, then at those moments when different pieces of the web fall out, the other pieces should be strong enough to fill in the gaps. That also hopefully is a good conversation to have around Somalia. Because there, again, the national level state is not really working. But what can the other pieces of the governance arena look to and do? And on that note, I also think that when we talk about governance, we need to think about it in two ways. One, as public governance, and there was a lot of focus on the state here and international players, and the other is on private governance. Now, as soon as I say that, often what that triggers, corporations, the private governance space. To me, there's two pieces to the private space. One is the corporations. What are the private actors doing? Doing corporate accountability work, there's a lot of issues there, but they're a player. So that's a governance node. But the one I really want to put on the table is that communities, which we've heard about being involved in consultations, can also be a governance node. Community governance can be a concept that I think can be relevant to this discussion that we're having. And that relates to the scale. This problem to me is too big for us to rely on government. We need to also rely on leadership from communities where they're also solving the problem with the other parts of the equation. So I end there.
Thank you very, very much. Very provocative and interesting. The floor now goes to Ms. Tarzikhan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ennen, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be on this panel and to be able to offer my personal perspective as a humanitarian and as someone that has been working in the field. So someone asked earlier whether we should wait for government solutions or whether we should wait for a more social movement. I'm here to argue that we need a social movement that will help change the anti-immigrant sentiment. People need to get out of their comfort zones and go meet these refugees that are being categorized as threats to national security. And when more and more of these stories are uplifted, I think that's when the discourse could really change. So I'm going to offer my perspective from my time working in Lesbos. So I'm a Syrian American, and I was able to leave Syria easily just because I had a different passport. So I left at the start of the war by plane. And then when the refugee crisis escalated in Europe in 2015, the media was filled with images of refugees arriving on the shores of Greece on these makeshift boats. And I was horrified by the images that I was seeing. And so because I was able to easily leave, I just wanted to go see the situation for myself and know what it was like being there on the ground. So I went the first time to Lesbos before the EU-Turkey deal was implemented. And I worked with a humanitarian organization, and as Dr. Ennen listed, I worked on a variety of issues. But the first time I went there, I had an emotional guard up because I didn't really know what to expect. It was my first time working there on the ground, and as a Syrian that hadn't really endured these same situations, I didn't really know what it was going to be like emotionally. So then when I left, obviously I kept in touch with a lot of the people I had met because, you develop these relationships and then naturally a relationship of trust was established. So when I returned the second time, it was much easier for them to open up to me, and they were no longer considered distant people. They were now considered either friends or family. And for me to be hearing all the horrific journeys that they had gone through, I felt the need that in this current administration needs to be spread on a much wider scale. So I decided to develop a social media platform called Meet a Refugee to share the stories of some of the people I had met along the way. And my hope is to expand the project so that other law students could be able to directly meet these refugees and offer their specific skill sets in order to build this sense of community, and so that a dialogue can happen. So I think when world leaders fail to take responsibility for their actions and fail to come up with diplomatic solutions, it's up to people like us and law students to carry on that responsibility. So I'm just going to list some examples of ways that you can help, because it's very easy to feel hopeless in the face of this huge crisis, when in fact there are very simple, easy, manageable ways that you can help. So I would say for the Northeastern students, use your public interest co-op to go and see the situation at the Mexico border for yourself, for example. Donate some of your time and volunteer for resettlement agencies, or apply to be a member of IRAP or the immigration clinic. By sharing my story, I hope I can compel you all to try and make a difference with whatever skills that you have to offer. This is a protracted issue, but it's going to require multiple skill sets, and it's going to require a multidisciplinary solution and involvement on all levels. So there are many other ways you can welcome newly arrived refugees by contacting resettlement agencies, donate to organizations that are working on the ground, remain aware of the conditions that people are fleeing, and stay engaged in the crisis, even if it has left the media spotlight. Because it's very easy. I mean, now the attention in the media is no longer on Lesbos, for example. So it's important to know that these conflicts have not gone away and the situations have not improved. And also try to change the narrative by sharing these stories and talking to people and trying to share the discourse and the rhetoric. And this could be done by amplifying refugee voices and meeting them one-on-one. To talk more specifically about climate refugees, refugees can number tens of millions in the next decade due to climate change. As we mentioned earlier, climate change did play a part in exacerbating the Syrian war with successive droughts, and that left 1.5 million people to migrate to the country cities between 2006 and 2011. And many of these people had no reliable access to food, water, or jobs. And so climate change, when added to existing social, economic, and political tensions, has the potential to ignite violence and conflict with disastrous consequences. Whether it's at the US border, the Mediterranean shores, and the sub-Saharan region in Africa, millions of people are going to continue to flee persecution, and this will only get worse due to climate change. And richer nations are also not immune from climate change. The changing weather patterns like the hurricanes that occurred last year in parts of the US, specifically in Puerto Rico, left many displaced, and many people still don't have access to electricity and energy needs. And this issue needs to be considered a top priority for policymakers, business leaders, but it also has to come from within the community. So another example of another project that I was involved with after seeing the energy needs in camps in Greece, there were no winterization plans in place. And when you first think of Greece, you think of it as a warm island, but in fact it does snow in Lesbos, and at the time there were no winterization plans. So by conducting a needs assessment, I realized that one way that we can address a small issue would be by collaborating with engineers and seeing if we could come up with something. So one of the things, because there were no winterization plans in place, a lot of people had died due to hypothermia in the winter months and then dehydration in the summer months. And so by collaborating with a group of engineering students, we came up with a household fan that can both heat and cool, and using solar rechargeable battery. And while FAN cannot address many of the hardships faced by refugees, it was still a health and quality of life improvement. And it was just a small change that, was able to improve these conditions. And because of the EU-Turkey deal, the processing times have increased, and so people are living in very dire conditions. And so if you can at least make one small change and come up with a multidisciplinary solution by thinking outside of the box and strategically trying to see what collaborations you can make, I think we can, really not only be reactive to these crises, but also aim to preempt them in the first place.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers. Professor Burleson, can you hear us okay now?
Yes.
Wonderful. We're going to try for a few minutes to have a dinner party conversation. We'll see how it goes. We won't push it if it's too difficult. Let me just first throw it to you, Professor Burleson. Do you have any questions for your fellow panelists?
Well, I'm just pleased that we all landed on the same approach, and that it strikes me that this addressing non-governance in the context of the increase in people crossing borders as a result of disasters, and in particular climate-related disasters, needs to be addressed. And we're all in agreement that it needs to be addressed not only by actual governance, but the collaboration at all levels of government and non-governmental entities. And we've just gotten a great case study, and we've just gotten a great, language from different contexts. If we look at the pieces of law we actually have, how do you work around that to fill the available niches? What niches do you see in the existing laws that can be expanded with a civil society approach, where we're not just talking about private sectors lobbying into niches, but looking at the NGOs and universities and all the other collaborations out there, the faith-based communities, to be working from what we've got and building it in a humanitarian direction.
So I can briefly touch upon this. Like another example, I don't know if you're all aware of the public charge rule that was proposed. So this rule aims to make it harder for people to apply for non-immigrant visas to come to the US. So an example, even if this is being implemented on a much bigger scale, there are ways locally that you can kind of make change. So the first thing would be to comment. So this is just a proposed rule, so you have 90 days to issue comments, and you can, talk about the health ramifications that this rule will have. I did briefly some research on this, and I was looking to see what the impact of increased ICE enforcement was having on healthcare access to immigrants. And it led to, through my research, I found that this rule has much broader ramifications. Like one example, the rule isn't targeting refugees specifically, but because of this climate of fear, refugees are declining to go seek healthcare services that they have the right to access. So an example would be to go into the community, partner up with community leaders and people who already have established relationships with the refugees, to educate them and inform them that they do in fact have the right and that they shouldn't be afraid, because they do have access to these services. So I think if you start locally, and by creating, using existing partnerships that you already have, you can get to like a bigger aim.
Maybe one thing that brought to mind, I think what Sean was talking about on the second panel for me, which is that as you were talking about the process of looking at the 90-day rule, that at least for human rights practitioners, we're not as used to thinking about administrative mechanisms or building the institutions scale things, or the documentation is too often the focus. And I think what you're bringing up is really, there's a lot more to be done in these other spaces that needs a lot more attention. And for me, one of my questions for you is, how do you take what you've done and begin to expand it? I think that's one of the questions. Is there's examples like yours. Have you already thought about how you expand? So the scaling question, I think, is a big question for me.
Yeah, so I've definitely encountered that issue and trying to find ways. I think nowadays with social media, it's easy to share a post and once one person sees it, then another person sees it. But I do think it's going to require using old methods and just talking to people. For example, there's also a case that I also have to bring up. So there's this movement in Europe to criminalize humanitarian work. And so one of my friends, Sara Mazzini, is currently detained along with two other peers. And what we encountered was, we launched a social media campaign, we launched a petition, but we weren't getting the number of signatures that we needed. So that initiative, for example, required going and talking to people that you're not necessarily like outside of your circle. So going to like a cafe and setting up a booth, in an area where you're not really going to be familiar with the people that you're coming in contact with. So I think it is a difficult issue that I've encountered too, because I don't know how to, scale my new project. But I think, the more people are aware, I think slowly like will catch attention. I don't know if you have any others.
I think one fantastic means by which to do that are the Conference of the Party gatherings annually and semi-annually of the climate talks. It is the most amazing gathering of humanity. And you get people who come from a given perspective walking in and trying to fit into a 1 to 2 week experience that is both governmental and non-governmental. But the folks caring about migration have largely been told they're part of the adaptation conversation, and they've pushed back and said, well, wait a second, and then went as far as creating a whole, Paris wouldn't have gotten a whole Article 8 on loss and damages if it had been left solely to the nation states, because they weren't ready to have that conversation. It was civil society that really pushed that conversation and said, and the small island nation states, indicating that it's not a matter of adapting. Some places are literally going to be totally underwater. All sovereignty is going to be lost. People are going to displace willfully or at the last minute. And there is a real notion of loss and damage. And is the international community going to participate in any sort of monetary involvement in that process? And so these disparate conversations that swirl and overlap in these climate talks is a wonderful means by which to inform the existing conversations that are happening within these epistemic communities, in universities, in responding to given crises that arise, but also the ongoing discussions that governments are already used to having.
One other thought that came to mind in your question is, how do you scale? I think it brings in a different discipline, which is entrepreneurial stuff. Not just lawyers, not just law schools, but is there a business, an MBA program here that you can reach out to that has a nonprofit focus? There are people that have expertise in how you take your idea and you move it. And that's a different discipline than I think we as lawyers are used to. But it's one that I think is underutilized and seems to be important to the equation if we're thinking about not relying on funding from government all the time.
Yeah, and I also had a question for you. So you talked about how the need for resilient governance. How do you make that happen when you have different stakeholders and member states that don't agree on the same solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, there's two sides to this. One is if you actually get the web of different reinforcing things, then it's more resilient. But then there's the building the web of in the first place.
Yeah.
But that, I think, offers up opportunities instead of always saying, oh, this is a lost cause and giving up. Look to the other places and say, let's build it out here, because that's the opportunity right now. And that's what it's going to take. I mean, we're talking about a whole century of things that we're going to have to build governance systems. So if this state can be the model, or if this country, if New Zealand can be the model for refugee jurisprudence, then let's look at, that's great. Then that can spread. If Massachusetts somehow would become a model, or some state level, let's embrace that and put energy there. If what you're doing can be a model, then let's elevate that as an iconic model that can then be spread.
I'll jump in with a question for the three of you. I like to take this metaphor Professor Giannini has given us of...
We're at dinner. Can you call me Tyler?
Tyler, I appreciate that. So you've given us this metaphor of layers of governance that constitute a resilience web. So there's redundancy throughout the web to be available to help in times of crisis at any particular level. And when I think of climate change, I very naturally, perhaps it's a lazy habit, think of the international level, but you draw our attention to the local level, and there's a lot of interest in human rights cities here at Northeastern Law School. And so my question for the three of you is, at the municipal level, what would you envision as you're talking about models, a model of municipal policy or municipal governance that can help us start to build toward this more resilient web?
I think for coastal communities, it is understanding the powerful nature of coastal preservation and restoration, and having hunkered down for Sandy and had energy students show up from the Rockaways, it was the loss of those, say, oyster beds off the Rockaways, or the mangroves off of the Louisiana southern coast, or the mangroves globally. I've been, in recent years, a member of the IUCN delegation, and the mantra has been nature-based solutions. But as each community is discussing hard infrastructure, and the walls are, the wall discussions happening both in the immigration context, but also in the coastal resilience context, these, the notion of building hard walls versus building soft, intact coastal communities. Now that has a lot at stake, particularly when you're talking about Florida hotel real estate. Anyone who teaches property law and covers takings and wetlands and such knows that there's a whole series of wetlands cases that are not well defined and highly controversial, and a lot of money is at stake. But in many settings globally, IUCN, for instance, has involved in helping local communities actually replant mangroves. And it's not necessarily fun to be, waist high in slosh and muck, but, getting little baby mangroves seedlings from IUCN and having the funding and the coordination to put them back in front of your village that's eroding away, that's one model. And not all communities are coastal. So, it's a coastal conversation. But it's one that also, it brings together the mitigation community with the adaptation and loss and damage communities to the degree that people totally, have conversations in one. Many people cross these conversations and talk in multiple ways. But, as countries or even municipalities, often it's the municipalities leading the way, particularly places like New York City, on trying to address their mitigation and bring down their emissions. The context of forests, well, those coastal wetlands are also in that same capacity capable of being sinks. And the Paris Agreement talks about sinks and sources. So if you can combine something that is a sink both for bringing down emissions with a way for communities to be resilient and not have to leave, or when they do leave, re-coordinate and make their new setting more resilient, because a lot of people are having to go from disaster to disaster to disaster. I've been ground zero for 4 major huge hurricanes. I've hiked out of wildfires out west. I mean, it's not the case that you're necessarily going to find the perfect spot and get to stay there. And it's really a notion at the international and municipal level of reciprocity. The reason why you help is in part it should be pure compassion, but it should also be a notion of the safety net. Wherever there is help required in the future disaster, there's going to be help received.
Do either of you have other models to suggest either in existence or in your mind's eye?
So to me, if you're at the city level, what I would start with, if we've labeled the structural power imbalances and the intersectional problems, that could be institutionalized. The solving of that problem could be institutionalized in part of the solution. Meaning that the justice element, meaning that you have to think about, if we're looking just to private and the market to solve this, it's not going to be adequate because we know who's going to get left behind. So we need to actually have policy that integrates what we see as that systemic structural problems into the policy. And then you need to think about the layers at the city level, like homes. You're going to get into housing codes, right? You're going to be down at that level because you can build a house that's resistant to hurricanes, but the only people that can afford it are not the people who are poor, right? So can you change the housing codes? Can you have redevelopment and planned redevelopment that starts to take you away from the coast? That's what mangroves is about. Redevelopment opportunities that are planned so that the resilience is built in over time instead of building on top of places that are risky. That's a planning thing that's at the more city level or neighborhood level. So there are various dimensions to it, but you really have to get to those levels and look, this is a housing issue. It's down to the individual house.
Yeah, I think Tufts is doing some work on this. They published a study because Boston, in a few years, or I mean, in like 10 or 20 years, it showed that it could be underwater. So it was looking at ways to make, roads and houses also more resilient to sea rising levels. So that could also be something, interesting model to look at if you're more interested.
I am delighted to report that the dinner party metaphor worked, and I thank all of you for being adventurous with me on that issue. And I would love to open up the conversation now to the entire audience to comment or question.
Yeah, so I guess a comment on that last comment and a question on that last issue that Elizabeth raised. For me, thinking about a municipal model, what looking at subnational governance does is open up the possibility for more participation, right? More participation of the people who are affected. And so you've got different models that many urban areas are pursuing, like co-design, which are very much engage the people that are most affected. You've got opportunities to engage in education, human rights education, in a way that brings people, onto the same platform in terms of solving these problems. In any system, you've got issues of implementation on the ground, street level bureaucrats that aren't fully, engaged with what the policies are and so on. And at a local level, it's much easier to address those issues. And what I worry about with sort of a more voluntarism kind of approach is the lack of democratic participation. That what you end up doing is relying on, if it's trying to scale it out, you rely on funding from philanthropists that have their own agendas, and you're driven by that as opposed to something that really is rising up from the bottom. And so, I guess that's sort of a question. You're talking about the web, and so maybe there's a role for everything, but are you concerned about the sort of democratic deficit in model that relies more on voluntarism?
Well, my first instinct is, having spent 15 years helping a single Bosnian refugee family, it is exhausting for everyone involved to be trying to meet the needs of someone who shows up with a shirt on their back. Coming from a UN family, I distinctly remember at age 8, the family, a Nepali family that was based in Haiti, showing up on our doorstep, again, with their shirts on their back. And they were UN diplomats. They just flee, they literally just left with, they pulled out. And so when you're doing that hand to mouth, which is what Alex has been doing so beautifully, it is essential. And at the end of the day, what we care about at the international level as one of our first and foremost principles is the right to life. And, climate displacement is also at its core about the right to life. And it happens effectively in disaster after disaster after disaster, where through the kindness of ordinary people who happen to be on the receiving end, sharing resources, that's where it works. But that doesn't mean it can't also happen effectively through initiatives that set up evolving best practices, help partner. I'm mindful of one entrepreneurial woman in the Gulf Coast who just happened to have the wherewithal of communicating with people who showed up in their ordinary boats and wanted to help. And she was able to say, hey, look, they need help over there. And this armada of private boats was able to be effective because she went around different neighborhood social media sites and read the SOS calls and was able to field those. But that works and that's effective, but there are many effective ways to do this, and it can happen at every level. If it does not happen at the most local level, it's unlikely to be effective if it solely happens at the international level, because then that's beautiful paper language and not necessarily effective implementation. But the effective implementation doesn't necessarily need to come just by people having new people show up and having to simply respond through whatever civil society organizations are already in that small locality. And municipalities that are urban and large might have a better system already in place. But many of the border communities are often tribal, are open lands, are huge deserts, have swaths where it's inhospitable to flee. And so for those situations, it's nice to actually bring resources. And I think some of those humanitarian entities, be it the Red Cross or others, should be partnering effectively, and often are partnering effectively, but without enough resources. But we should be able to get past this hand-to-mouth, one disaster at a time response.
It's a great question. For me, let's take the co-design piece of this as maybe an example. There's two ways that can happen. As you said, the worry about this being put into co-design that's just voluntary in the philanthropy space, that's my concern too, is that essentially the state abandons its obligations. So to me, the sweet spot is if you can get the legal system, the state, to institutionalize the co-design piece. And then that's institutionalized in the state. So that becomes de jure. But I also want to be able to deal with a situation which is more de facto, where the state, in fact, is unwilling or unable to do its job. And so we also want to activate that de facto space, which may look voluntary but shouldn't be, but avoiding the gamesmanship of states abandoning this. I think, that's always the dilemma in human rights. We have a conflicted relationship with states. We don't trust them, but we kind of have to trust them.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. So it's sort of piggybacking off of this conversation. If we, from a human rights perspective, if we don't trust states, but we need to, where do we situate? So UNFCCC has recently used the Talanoa Dialogue which is a community-based conversation that addresses where are we, where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there. And through sort of like a dinner party, a warming of the conversation, and through relaying mutual respect to each member that's engaged in creating a solution, that's how they start to meet the previously designated goals from the Paris Agreement. So I guess the question is twofold. One, where's the value in this, and how can, on an international level, how can we sort of offer the level of respect that it deserves. And two, on your notion of private governance and community as a privatized entity working within governance, how do you, Tyler, think through where the responsibility is then placed? Is it then on the community to like sell itself? Or is it, I guess, where's the responsibility placed?
Maybe I can start with that last piece. I think as soon as you say community governance, I think it brings up a really interesting question or a bunch of questions about whether there's duties there.
Right.
That's basically what you're at. From a human rights perspective, we think about where the duties lie. And in puzzling over this in various conversations, it's a really hard one. I think for me, the first step is to move communities from being passive beneficiaries to having agency that's valuable, and to embrace the knowledge and talent that they have, as that's what real respect means to me. It's about actually bringing them into co-design. I think if you're going to say one word, co-design is a really different thing than consultation.
Yeah.
And if the UN process is doing co-design, it's really different. And the communities who are at the table will know that it's co-design if instead of token consultation.
I think it was very powerful in Durban. The host South African government brought in this notion of intabas and really introduced it as a really important means by which we were going to figure out what shared vision there was. And post-Copenhagen, there were entities that didn't necessarily think there was any shared vision left. And so, sovereign entities felt like their sovereignty had been infringed upon. Civil society had felt like participation, which was enshrined in the UNFCCC process, had been shunted for national security. And it was a process of rebuilding a shared vision. And it worked beautifully. Initially, entities, both governmental and non-governmental, kind of thought this was going to take a while. But it worked. And, in the same context that this dinner table conversation approach works, it was this tone as opposed to the reading off of the speeches. And people really shifted their thinking as they were speaking, and they realized there was common ground. And that has continued in every discussion since, and it's working effectively. It's written right into the Paris Agreement to have this 2018 facilitated dialogue and these stock takings that are, and so what's really instrumental about the UNFCCC process is that it is an enormous experiment in involving civil society in environmental decision-making and the codification of international law. And it's a very different context than an individual civil or civil political or economic, social, and cultural right, or whatever human right has been arguably infringed upon. Do you identify a duty and a responsible party, and that construct within international human rights law or domestic human rights law or the regional human rights treaty bodies, and the judicial approach? It's really a legislative approach where you're involving entities within civil society to help legislate. And so that is a venue, but not the only venue. I'm all with Matthew that there is still potential to work within this discrimination context in our existing 1951 Refugee Convention. I think that shouldn't be taken off the table. I think that's still important as well.
I saw several other hands up.
I was struck by something that you said, Tyler, if I may call it, that there is a protection gap when it comes to foreign refugees because states have decided not to fill that gap, to do anything about it. So how do we try and get the states to address this elephant in the room, basically, because we are going to be faced with 20 million, 200 million, whatever the number is on there, the number of refugees in the
So I actually feel like since Alex spoke about the social movements, it's probably a movement. And I'm wondering how much you've had success on that front. And part of my question, if we continue the dinner table one, was how do you sustain it? How do you deal with the fatigue? Because social movements, I think this is part of the answer to you. How do you maintain a social movement over time? Because that's what it's going to take for this to get on the agenda. But you're living that real time.
Yeah, I mean, there are ups and downs. You know, it is hard to keep the momentum going. But what I personally do is, you know, it's very easy to be very overwhelmed when you see this on a very big scale, but just, you know, piece it into smaller components and see you as an individual, what can you do? What skill sets can you bring? And try to you know, piece it into like smaller pieces just so that it's not that overwhelming. But it is hard. It is hard, you know, with the administration and all the crises going on around the world. There are so many issues to get involved in, but I think, I don't know, I try to see it, okay, as long as I'm doing my part, I'll be okay. And as long as I try and inspire others to also do the same, then that's how I would approach it.
And to me, if the Nansen Initiative and the platform work, there'll be other places that are doing the same, and then it's about connecting them.
Mm-hmm.
And made a different context. So the guiding principles on business and human rights, that's a Nansen Initiative like kind of thing. It sparked, because it was incomplete, a treaty movement, which is ongoing. So it could be that Nansen is now the platform with social movements to go to treaty.
I'm trying to look at it from the perspective of a environmental right lens. And I'm seeing that, and then just going back, remember when the U.S. Walk of Paris, a number of municipalities, cities, businesses, like in the U.S., for example, got together and said, well, this is what the federal government is saying, but we are very much committed to move this to the next level. And they came together. And so the question was trying to figure out in terms of maybe municipal level, so like ordinances or chapter, what that commitment would be like in the country, whether that's something that when you look into. The other aspect that I'm trying to say is that even within the U.S., even though there isn't the right to the environment in the U.S. Constitution, I know there may be a number of states that actually do have that in the U.S. for the right to the environment. And then there's probably a lot more other countries outside of the U.S. that actually have enshrined in their constitution the right. If they don't have that, then in their own jurisdiction, so bring with interpretation of what that right would be. And then we've seen literally in the last 5 years, there's been this fluid of climate litigation going on. So the whole idea of how do you link that to the movement? So how do you see how this will be anchored into that kind of process? Going forward and looking at beyond the border, where, for example, we're seeing some success story in Europe around litigation, some success story in Southeast Asia, like in the Philippines, where the Human Rights Institute have made some decisions around this kind of processes, and just taking advantage of the fact that these municipalities have made a decision. There are some states that have signed on the right to the environment. How do we advance this again? Just taking advantage of the kind of framework that already exists and how we advance that.
I couldn't quite hear. I didn't respond on that one.
My apologies for that, then I'll turn to the two of you.
This is sort of an impossible question. I guess maybe because as I interpreted the question was, where I went with it was, is the anchor for creating a global movement environmental rights, or is it refugee rights, or is it displacement? And I don't know if that's why I think I don't know which one is the big motivator. When I hear platform on disaster displacement, that does not seem like a movement builder. But I also look at the political reality of today, and I'm not sure refugees and displacement does either. And environment's not very deeply anchored as a movement builder globally. A lot of people want to support it, but as a movement builder, not sure.
But I mean, I just want to cut you, but I mean, you have all these governments that are agreeing their constitution and saying there's a right. So why aren't people taking advantage of what already exists in this constitution?
I have a gut instinct that this belongs in multiple venues. I don't know that it needs a single anchor. I think that if we can't be omniscient and try and figure out how to best achieve this, I think you start in many directions. And you see this with climate litigation and climate legislation. And I mean, people are trying everything on the climate front from every direction. That may not be the optimal approach. That might not be the way that Jefferson and Hamilton might have hammered it out if they'd had the time to sit there and discuss it. But we are lacking time, much more so than anything else. And movements evolve slowly. And treaties, unless you're terrorist treaties, or maybe even landmine treaties, it evolves slowly. For the most part, they evolve slowly. And we have run out of time for that evolution. So trying things from multiple directions all at the same time, as long as they don't end up creating conflicts in international law, where one context says one thing and the other says the opposite, I don't see any problem with having multiple responsibilities in different contexts, because you're already siloed. That's already the problem at international law, is that you have these silos of, even within public international law, of disparate parts of international law, and you've got epistemic communities that really don't know the vocabulary or the discourse of even a closely related area within international law. And you definitely see that within the human rights and the environmental communities.
And so that seems exactly right. I think bringing back to the beyond borders, seems like the multiple anchors, this is a discussion about climate change. That's the unifier. And to me, the social movement of the last century was human rights in this country, civil rights movement of the 60s. The social movement of this coming century is climate change.
There's time for one more question. Sorry.
Hi. So I was wondering, under this, the severity that climate change poses, right? All these crises, and itself as its own enormous crisis. We're talking about that private governance sphere and like the corporate and the community sort of dichotomy. I was wondering, really, how do we reconcile the corporate aspect with the community aspect? Because I think there's this an inherent tension between the drive for short-term opportunity inherent to a capitalist corporation versus the now survival need and demand for long-term community-based development. So I'm really wondering, given the time constraints that we have now for the survival of humanity, can we really reconcile those under the structures that we have right now? Or is there just a need for sort of taking public governance on one hand, and instead of really private governance with corporate and community, rather have the public governance and community governance?
two thoughts. In the mitigation context, in the renewables sector, you've got some businesses working very effectively. In the context of displacement, it's not that same conversation. And in the extractive context, you've got businesses trying to shut the whole conversation down. The UN itself proper interacts with 9 groups, and they've been distinct and they've been longstanding. You've got farmers, you've got the tech community, you've got youth, you've got the research community that encompasses the universities and such, and they are in many different conversations, both embryonic treaties coming into being, and also the ongoing effective implementation of treaties. So when you get to something like the climate talks, back in 1991, we all fit in the basement of the UNICEF building, all of civil society and the nonprofit, the business community. Anything that wasn't a government, managed to fit into that one discussion. Much more recently, you've got an enormous group of non-governmental participants in this context, and they've splintered into bingos, business, environment NGOs, youth NGOs, research NGOs. So you've got ringos, angos, bingos, and they're not talking to each other, not as effectively as they could be. But where there's common ground, they're starting to meet up in venues that are on topic, and they're starting to overlap and interact. And that's just one venue. But once you don't have a nicely set up tent city like the Conference of the Parties for the annual UNFCCC meetings, it's harder for those entities to meet. But once you've got Bloomberg or Gates or someone putting on these private conferences, you now have a lot of entities, at least in the mitigation conversation, huddling and trying to respond effectively. But it's not necessarily happening as effectively on a topic like displacement because that hasn't gotten the momentum. There aren't as many people working on that topic.
I had a couple thoughts. One is I go back to Martha's comment about co-design. So if you have co-design between communities and states, then maybe it becomes tri-design, but if it's really authentic, you'll deal with the power imbalances. It's got to be authentic, right? That's a heavy lift, but that's the model. If you don't have the state acting, then you can move the conversation to, is better practice, effective practice in the private sphere really co-design as well? But again, the power imbalances are severe. But if you state that as, it's not just consultation for private industry with communities, it's actually got to be co-design, it changes what the measuring stick is. So that's one piece. And then maybe this is actually part of the answer to Alfred, which is litigation.
Well, that's access to justice. When you've got those 3 prongs of access to information, public participation, and access to justice is largely the civil right to sue. And not every piece of legislation comes with the civil right to sue. And when you don't necessarily get children able to have their rights heard in court, in the case that's underway right now, it's still in limbo, where not the children's climate case is going to be heard. But you've got, say, the state of New York actually suing an extractive industry, one of the Seven Sisters. And so that conversation is, the climate litigation is cropping up as a means by which to try and get somewhere faster than the climate international treaty negotiation conversation, which is not going any more slowly than other international treaty negotiations, but is not going remotely as fast as the IPCC or any of the scientific community is saying is requisite to actually addressing effectively climate disruption.
In fact, sorry, I just wanted to say also that even here in the US, there's even a number of states that are actually taking action against the federal government. So especially for law school students, this is the kind of English they can anyway and figure out what sort of jurisprudence they develop around these issues.
Would you like the last word? No, I was just gonna say to maybe just look at, try and do some more research on what incentives here and businesses in order to make those collaborations happen.
And with that, we will draw this panel to a close. I would like us all to take a moment and thank our wonderful panelists. I would also like to take just a moment to work with the law review students. Absolutely extraordinary, and I thank them as well for a wonderful, wonderful day.
So everyone, thank you all for coming and staying with us. I hope this was a productive discussion. It certainly was for us. We invite everyone, if you continue to have thoughts on this with panelists, with law students and non-law students that are in this room, to consider writing for one of our several channels that we have at the Law Review. We have phenomenal legal blog called our online forum. It's a great space to write more informal thought pieces. We also have our online version of the journal called Extra Legal that, it's a great space to produce and publish more research pieces. So if you have any questions about that, go to our website, nulawreview.com. It has a ton of information on there. What? NURV.org. Oh, .org, sorry. This is why Liz is managing editor. And we will have a reception outside. We invite everyone to join us there for some well-needed hydration and snack. But before we all leave, I'd love for Dean Hook, if you have any words to say.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Before people bolt for the doors and there's a reception, if it's all set up outside. I'm Sarah Hook. I'm Associate Dean of Research and Information here at Northeastern University. And today I'm especially proud to also be the faculty advisor to the law review here. They've been a wonderful group to work with. Today is, I think, an exemplar of what our law review school tried to do, to bring together students and faculty, practitioners, and activists, people from across disciplines, international, local, national, on cross-cutting problems, and kind of come up with positive, constructive, activist things that can be done and scholarship on it. And so I'm very proud of the work. I want to thank the speakers and the moderators and the panelists that we've had today. They've been wonderful. And also thank our co-sponsors. It's the first year, I think, that we've done, we have 5 organizations that work together on this. It's not only the Law Review, which we're doing, but co-sponsorship from Berkeley, the Program on Human Rights and the Global Economy here at the law school, the Earl Wallenberg Institute, IRAP, locally, nationally, and the Center for Public Advocacy and Collaboration here at the law school, building on that. So thank you for making that possible. And as Dean Hackett said, this has been a particularly inspiring group of students to work with this year. Everything you do is just great. I hardly have to think, you just have done it. It's great. But especially to the 2 symposium editors, both Tarzikhan and Anna Maria Anino, who started working way last year before they were even in their positions as symposium editors to make this possible and put it together and make it come out today. So thank you for that. Thank you.
A few of my fabrics. Sorry.
Broken ice.
Thank you. This is not, I'm not going to come in and try to. These two single pods, the one downstairs, so I'm sorry, and like all of them. So can you guys just like And also to not have power has been a big manage your right. It's like for all the and the only reason I know is that, like, I've heard this right. Yeah, I know. It's a line, and like now I almost where I'm the other side of the idea that now. Yeah, 100 miles. 100 miles. It's not even a border thing, right? Like there's one person you mentioned. Yeah, but yeah. Yeah, what happened all? There's only like the week there was 2 levels. And they would talk about it in the context of like researchers that have to produce outside of it, and like how it's so hard. Like it's reaching an interesting. Yeah, it's like all of with the border become like there's a divide between border and not border, and it's like and you become the second class right? Just looking at themselves citizens themselves become a second class. You now have the business zone, right? Right. Right. It's much more creative, and it's not the same as right, but this is a national law that is proportional. Borders that are becoming much. Right. I just think about like what are the guidelines for creating? I don't know, like where does that zone end? Like how do you yeah, it seems really arbitrary. And they were like, they didn't change it. It's always been different. I don't there's been checks with that's poorly yeah, why? Yeah. I mean, why? That's how they do employment. Right. What? But yeah, no, it's already more, it's in the statute, so it's much more about like the parameters. But it's always been just for California that you live in Texas, you also experience more for the Southwest, because like there's parts where I think you got it closer to I guess right. A lot of California. Right. Yeah. They're much more. Right. So there's that like they put it down. It's like a mechanism. And then they start. So sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. I haven't. But she bridge. Yeah, it's like a drawbridge, and she would have to go through. I think now we're seeing and you could also like people on 93 all the time. Literally in Montreal for the summer, and then we had And was all the things that get arrested, and I was like, but yeah, now it's on 9:30, so it's much more crazy, but by no means
Do not worry about
new or even like.
It does worry.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go.
I'm singing your praises.
Thank you for everything. You did a great job. I know it was difficult. No, I know, but it wasn't really a dinner. Like, you did the dinner party
Thanks for the
conversation.
conversation.
Yeah.
We were just thinking back about those
So
days.
like, remember, I was like, meditate, and we're all like, okay, what do we do with that?
Well, don't think about that.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for being here. I recommend we Google the well, if you, I will chase you. Well, chase you. No. And I will say, like, I think I personally love that. There are books I well, the reason is we're not, yeah, and then everybody, exactly. Are you sure you don't want to stay for one thing?
Thanks so much, Dean. Oh, thank you for everything. You guys were phenomenal. Everyone's coming up to me and saying, "You've got it all taken care of." It's wonderful. You should be an event organizer.
Oh gosh. I like, after I could speak for a week.
No, I'm sure you do.
No, I'm so glad. I mean, and apart from just like, which at the end, and we had done, I can remember back because we had done an entire two with her 2 years ago, to the point where she was like measuring how far she was. But I think it was the papers that no one, and
near her left hand on the table, and I couldn't something like, it's just like moving papers. But the other thing was, they said they couldn't use the microphone because I was like, I don't know what they did. So here's with all of the people that have remote.
so this is like, so my understanding was they could have used them until like, but they would just have to like not like talk right into it, which is what I thought. Yeah. And then today Jacob told me actually no, you shouldn't use them at all. So
I don't, yeah,
yeah, but it's fine. I think I mean
no, people can hear.
Yeah.
It's just a question of why second are not useful, or is it only?
Well, I guess they were useful for or like the first panel.
It's the first one when everyone was here. Yeah. But I didn't realize that you had
So this is a YouTube that was good.
So it's new, right? So like it's not been tested, or like Displacement is new, and our Facebook live stream that's also new, so that cut out at some point. So it worked until the keynote. Then bye. Thank you so much, Abby.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Myron. Thank you.
I used to drive in, but I don't have a parking spot anymore. I know, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks so much.
But I think like overall though, and I mean, so the Professor Baba, until last night she didn't have a PowerPoint, and then this morning she was like, actually I want to put something.
Okay.
So that's why like she gave it to me when she got here. So I didn't have a clicker for her because we had specifically like said, oh no, these are good things for us to learn. And like always think about these contingencies.
You know what I was going to kind of ask you to do, or you and Ennen to do, you'll be done with the rest of this, but well, you've done such a good job. Can you put together like a checklist or for the next group use? Because that's what happens every year. Some years people kind of have done this before, and other years they just don't think because they haven't done it before.
Yeah.
And you guys have thought of everything, so that would be great.
Well, not everything, but yeah, a lot.
No,
I mean,
or questions.
yeah, and like I was really happy with how it.
The audience, I was too.
And we had like Anna and I had a list of questions for each panel to like see if the audience was really
if they didn't.
And at one point we were like the legal borders panel. We were like,
that was
turned to them.
at the end. But then all of a sudden there was a flurry of questions, and I go, okay, I've got one, but then there was a flurry, so I went to the panelists afterwards. I asked him if you ever read this book's called The Little Ice Age in Army, and it was The Little Ice Age was climate change from the 1500s to the 1700s, and if you look worldwide. It was, I mean, that was the height of it, but it might have been actually broader. But if they go around the world, so they look at all the things that happen. And that was like when Europe decided to invade the Americas. Because resources were getting scarce, and the crops weren't going well, they didn't have enough sun, and all of this stuff. And that caused a lot of upheaval. Mayan civilization collapses, like all this.
Honestly, like any one of these topics we could spend an entire day.
Yeah.
Like each time someone said something, I was like, that would have been a great panel, like for panelists. Maritime borders that Professor at the very beginning. It's totally crazy. Like take up a whole day.
Pretty crazy. The maritime borders, and then the border now means it's 100 miles inside. Yeah, like what?
I know, so crazy.
It's just crazy. There's like, I mean. Yeah, I always learn a lot of things. The one that struck me, and it was 7 years ago. They had on gun rights in the military movement, and I was eye-opening because I was just like, oh yeah, we're Second Amendment. I didn't quite get it. But then they had people in talking about the growth of the militia and the growth of the right and growth of things. Like ever since then, I've watched it come true. And it was here. So it's like that's what these are so good at.
Yeah. It's still my dream to one day get this room filled for the Marby Symposium. We've never managed to quite do it. Get it fully. It's like so full.
No, I have several professors I'm going to send thank yous because sometimes they come, sometimes not. They at various spots. They're they're quite good.
No, there's and I know like I mean, Friday is generally Friday is sort of a active day for most people. So, but it's hard. Like no one wants to come in on a weekend. It's hard to do it in the middle of the week. It's hard to do it. It's like any day would be inconvenient for some people.
And you can't get the panelists.
I will say, I don't know if you were there. Last year.
I think I wasn't. It was
well, it was a terrible week. Like big upper level type finals or finals or something. And it was far less busy than it was today. So
what I did was I heard last year
I wasn't the advisor, and the date was picked by the deans and yeah, I don't know, but whoever they had coming. So they picked it. So this year, I'm going to have a student in spring, like April, and I said, hey, we're going to go to next fall. And he said, well, you're usually in like February, but last year it was in fall. Oh, what's a good fall date? So I grabbed this on months ago.
That's amazing. Well, I think maybe for next year we should, like, we're starting to think about it as a equal.
Yeah.
Push it back into the spring. It makes way more sense. Like Anna and I were like really rushed to like put this on, and it would have been nice to have had. And in that way, what we could also solicit articles from. And like
better for soliciting articles for people to
because I couldn't put a publication in position on any of our speakers.
No, it's too fast.
It was too fast.
Kristen Madison told me that like expert. She's done the longest time. She's like, well, in some ways, it's all good because they're my idea. She said, you got to line people up. The spring before, I'll say, already committed. In the summer, they're getting all fully committed to the next year's schedule. But in some ways, it's better. What I've seen some of the students do in past years, it would get to be like November, and they would say, oh, we're not really sure who the speaker's going to be.
Yeah, see, that's not okay. I want,
not okay.
yeah, so what I would want for us to do exactly what like Anna did over the summer, which is like lock down our speakers.
Yeah.
And like, you know, and then work, like have the time to work with them with this to really.
It would be one.
I don't know. We'd have to think about it.
Papers, even if the papers go on.
That's what I think because it feels, yeah, and it feels a little like it's such a pity that we,
I know.
Like I would love to hear all of them like have something to put up on it from all of these wonderful panelists.